Hello and welcome to the Center for Homeland Defense and Security Master's Thesis Series. Today I'm with Colby Stanton, the Director of Readiness for the Pacific Area, FEMA Region 9. Welcome, Colby.
Thank you.
So today we want to talk about your thesis, and you have a very unique job that covers some pretty much unknown areas to our massive domestic audience. So can you tell us the title of your thesis?
Sure. Punching Above Their Weight, the Homeland Security Contributions of the U.S. Pacific Territories.
And how did you choose this topic?
Well, for the past few years, I've been the Director of Readiness at FEMA Region 9's Pacific Area Office. And it's happened less since Hurricane Maria brought familiarity for most Americans with Puerto Rico. But for a long time, and still sometimes, I'd get a lot of confusion about who the PAO services, whether they're American citizens, those kinds of questions. We work with Hawaii, Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and American Samoa. And those aren't household names for most Americans. So it was really important to me, especially after talking to some of my coworkers here, to really try to stress to folks why the U.S. Pacific Territories are still important to national security, and specifically to Homeland Security practitioners, to try to open their eyes to something that they probably don't think about on a day-to-day basis, but that still has an impact on Homeland Security.
So what is the problem set?
Well, it's interesting. Originally, all three of those Pacific territories were brought into the fold for different purposes, but all generally around the military. But of late, especially with the rise of domestic issues, people haven't really paid attention, I think, to the issues of the Pacific, and specifically the efforts that China has made to gain inroads. I know it's very close to Indo-PACOM's heart. We spend a lot of time talking about the role of the Pacific, the freely associated states. Of course, the Compact of Free Association is coming up for renegotiation in 2024. So the role of the freely associated states gets discussed a lot, but Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa and their role in Homeland Security really hasn't been discussed in that context, and so I thought it was important to shine a light on it.
And you mentioned the lack of strategies that are a big problem. Can you kind of go through that again?
Sure. Yeah, one of the things that I found was interesting in my research was how often we have not fully utilize the national instruments of power. So of course, DIME is the framework I looked at it in my thesis. So diplomatic, informational, military, and economic tools. And the concept is that if you are strong enough in the other areas, hopefully you'll never have to use your military strength. And the territories play a significant role in that area. In particular, obviously, Guam and CNMI are very involved in the buildup as we move forces from Japan. But American Samoa as well plays a role out there in helping the rest of the Pacific understand U.S. sensibilities and interests. There's a lot of academic discussion and military discussion post-World War II, what was seen as essentially a period of benign neglect. The U.S. was very popular in the area after World War II, and in a sense, we rested on our laurels for quite a while. At the end of the Obama administration, we had, of course, the pivot to the Pacific, and Indo-PACOM still talks quite a bit about the importance of the area in helping China see that the U.S. approach to economic resilience, to diplomatic and free trade are all very important. But again, we have not really talked about whether having strong, resilient territories in the area would help us convey that message more effectively than we are today.
And why should the state, local, other federal agencies on the mainland care about this?
Well, in particular, I can see.
I don't ask that out of disrespect. I'm just
no, and I can see for state and local representatives, perhaps it's a little less pressing. Although I hope that an understanding of the role of the Pacific will help them understand perhaps why grant funding might go to the Pacific, which understandably they're competing for. But Homeland Security practitioners and DHS in particular definitely have a role to play in the Pacific. And for example, some of our past decisions within the department have not only affected the ability of other agencies within the department to implement our missions out there, in some cases they've actually been overturned by Congress because Congress has found that the way DHS has implemented our statutes has actually hindered our military readiness out there.
And so what are some other things that keep you up at night as you think about readiness in the Pacific and why we're not?
Well, certainly the last chapter of my thesis is all about the current economic situation in the Pacific. And again, Americans are very familiar with what happened in Puerto Rico. Happily, our Pacific jurisdictions, I don't think, are in quite that boat. But they do struggle economically. And my thesis talks about historically how they came to be part of the U.S. fold. In many cases, the draw for them was to gain the economic resilience of the U.S. And they have struggled, as many small island nations or communities do, with building an economic base. That leads to a lack of disaster resilience. And in my thesis, I talk about the challenges of emergency management in a community that is struggling to maintain its infrastructure, to bring in workers, to develop a labor base. And I think that those things, dealing with a major disaster, continue to be a worry. CNMI recently experienced Typhoon Yutu last year, was devastated, and we continue to recover from that. And I'd like to see long-term that we think as a nation about how we use our infrastructure rebuilding money, in particular Homeland Security grant funding, mitigation grant funding, how we work on our policies to try to build resilience in those areas, not just for the disaster management perspective, but also because I believe strongly that if we do that, they'll become even better representatives for us in demonstrating to other nations why the American way of life and our approach to Homeland Security and democracy and free trade are the ways to go if they want to continue to develop their own resilience.
And getting back to more of that international focus and how those islands can be very instrumental for good or ill. And so what are some of those threats that you're thinking about?
So Guam and CNMI and American Samoa are all parts of numerous groups that represent the small Pacific Island nations. The title in my the quote in my title, "Punching Above Their Weight," actually comes from a State Department representative talking about those island nations. The island nations have very large exclusive economic zones. So for fishing purposes, they control a great amount of space on the U.S. On the world that the U.S. depends on. And without those friendships, we could have struggles, not just in defending Guam and CNMI, but really in continuing as an economic power with access to the waterways. Obviously, the military is very concerned, and there's been a lot of discussion of the South China Sea. Yep. Well, Guam and CNMI are part of that second island chain that contains China. Once we start losing that kind of strength, you start to see very quickly how we could be retracting to our borders. And, no one wants to think about going to war, but buffer space is a good thing, and ability to create free trade and to implement do what we need to do to prepare and to implement war if necessary. All of that really, to me, starts with a strong American presence in the Pacific.
That's very well said. So tell us what your recommendations are.
Well, so I actually have four. The first, and we haven't really talked about it, but because of the way that the Constitution treats territories, and specifically the way that Congress has passed laws, we currently have a real hodgepodge of applicability. Just to give one example that affects Department of Homeland Security, in 2008, CNMI was brought into the U.S. Immigration system with specific allowances for CNMI to help them. Guam, too, is under U.S. immigration control, again with some varying limitations on them. American Samoa controls their own immigration entirely. So Customs and Border Protection really has a very limited, if non-existent role in American Samoa, while they're very active in Guam and CNMI. Things like that get very confusing. So my first recommendation is just that we take a look at the legal construct, and where there are differences, if they make sense, that's great. But if not, we should look at rendering greater consistency just to make things less confusing. My second recommendation has to do with how we, as the U.S. government, approach the territories. Right now, for those who aren't familiar with it, Puerto Rico actually has a task force out of the White House that manages U.S. government relations with them, whereas the other 4 U.S. territories, the 3 I've mentioned, plus the Virgin Islands, are administered out of the Department of the Interior's Office of Insular Affairs. And that's not to say that they haven't done a good job, but we haven't really looked at that since 1950s, when it was transferred from, or control was transferred from the Department of the Navy at the time to DOI. And I would just suggest that the world has changed a little bit in the last 70 years or so. Yeah, and so it might make sense to take another look at who owns or administers the territories. There are those who would say, well, Puerto Rico's model maybe isn't working, but I do think it's time to reevaluate that. My third recommendation has to do with the development of strategic metrics. And, for those in Homeland Security, we're all familiar with GPRA, the Government Performance Results Act, and the need for cross-cutting metrics, especially across programs that involve more than one agency. Homeland Security is clearly one of those. We don't have a common strategic plan for how we approach the territories. And I think that regardless of who administers the relationship with the territories, that one strategic plan would be a good idea. And finally, talking about infrastructure, as I did before, I'd like to see us look more at how we spend federal infrastructure dollars from regardless of agency, but I'm specific in my thesis talking about Homeland Security grant funding and mitigation funding, and looking at how we can get more bang for our buck in terms of, we gain $6 for every dollar spent on mitigation. I'm not sure that we've done a study on exactly what that expenditure looks like in the Pacific, but given how expensive it is to respond to disasters in the Pacific, I would think it's even higher than 6 to 1. So I think that some of those factors should come into play in assigning Homeland Security and mitigation funding. When you look at the Pacific territories, it's very difficult for them to compete on a numerical per capita basis. There were some early discussions with the Homeland Security grant funding that on a per capita basis, American Samoa was getting 10 times the money. I don't remember the actual number, but they were getting numbers that on a per capita basis looked ridiculous to folks on the mainland. But if you factor in the other roles that they play and how expensive it is to respond out there, I think that you may make a different calculation. And certainly I think FEMA is looking at that following Hurricane Maria, but I think that other organizations that are involved in policy determinations and in even legislation should be looking at those kinds of issues.
It seems to me that the cultural differences between the territories would be a huge issue if you're talking about standardizing. Mm-hmm. So are there any thoughts about what that might look like or what challenges you might face in trying to do that?
Yeah, and as I said, I don't think it should be standardized across the board. I do think we need to do an analysis. One of the issues that comes up, for example, is American Samoans are nationals, not citizens. Interesting, there was a law case last year, within the last couple of years, where an American Samoan citizen brought a suit to try to become they wanted automatic citizenship. And the government of American Samoa actually argued against that because they felt that they currently have greater freedom to implement their traditional Matai lifestyle and communal land ownership than they might under more strict implementation of the U.S. Constitution out there. So I see that there are opportunities where inconsistencies may help them, mm-hmm. but there's other areas where I really think that the inconsistencies are just legacies or accidental, and the immigration law is an interesting example of that. GAO did some work with American Samoa and Customs and Border Protection to look at whether it made sense for American Samoa to have its own immigration control. And really, the report finding was that a risk-based assessment needed to be made. As far as I can tell, that risk assessment has never been completed. And I think those are the sorts of things that we should be doing to look at, does it make sense for the immigration law to be different in American Samoa versus in Guam or CNMI?
Well, it's fascinating research that needed to be done, and good luck with it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being with us today.
Appreciate it.